In this module, we'll be covering the introduction to film and video. Fast.
Focus, aperture, shutter and color temperature. These are the principles of cinematography.
By combining focus, aperture, shutter and color temperature, fast. These combination of these elements, cinematic elements, allow you to create a wide range of cinematic, artistic results to get professional footage from anything from a little handy cam through to a professional film camera. Focus, aperture, shutter and color temperature will get you that look.
Fast.
Right, this is about how to take a focus. You zoom into what you want to focus on, all the way in to what you want to focus on, and then you set the focus, either using your automatic of the little handy cams or using the focus barrel of the lens, and then you zoom out. This will allow your subject to stay in focus if you ever zoom in further in later on. The reason why you zoom in to focus on something is because this is when your depth of field or depth of focus, or that which is acceptably sharp, is at its most critical. So you're zooming in order to make it critical, to make your depth of field critical and setting your focus. Then as you zoom out, everything starts coming into focus because your depth of field or your depth of focus is at its biggest when you're on a wide shot. So that's easy to remember. The tighter you are on the lens, the less depth of field you have, which is why you use that position to set your focus, and the wider you are on the lens, the more depth of field you have.
When you focus your lens on a subject, there are other areas that will also be in focus. Collectively, these areas are called the depth of field or depth of focus. The depth of field is the area in front of and behind the subject which the lens has been focused on. It is the area of sharp focus. Anything that does not fall into this area when you compose your shot will look blurry or soft. The depth of field is used artistically to direct the viewer's eyes to that which you or the director want them to see. The depth of field can be manipulated by many factors, mainly by aperture, but also by lens size, framing and shutter speed. You will see more of these examples as you work through this course.
So, remember, one of the aspects of depth of field is that the tighter you are, the less depth of field or depth of focus you have, and the wider you are, the more depth of field you have.
When you're focusing a shot, you must choose an object somewhere in your shot that's going to give you the focus you want for that whole shot. If your objects are far apart, such as the foreground object and the background object, you might not be able to get both of them in focus because your depth of field is not big enough. So you have to select a focus by eye that will give you the effect you need. And you might have to leave something soft in frame. Another way to increase your depth of field would be to stop down. This will give you a much deeper range of focus. As you can see, everything looks sharp at that same middle focus.
Stopping down refers to exposure, which is controlled by the aperture of the lens, which is directly manipulated by the iris. The iris in a camera lens alters the size of the aperture through which light falls onto the photographic film. This is called exposure. Exposure is measured in f-stops. F-stops range from 1.8 through to 22. The range varies from lens to lens. Each change from a low f-stop to a higher f-stop is equivalent to halving the amount of light falling onto the film or CCD. Each change from a higher f-stop to a lower f-stop is equivalent to doubling the amount of light in the shot.
So if you were to open up the lens by one stop, for instance, you would be doubling the amount of light you're letting onto the film. If you were to shut down the lens by one stop, you would be halving the amount of light that you're letting onto the film.
When you expose for a shot, you specify with the iris how much light is allowed onto the film or CCD. Your picture will either be dark and shadowy or underexposed, or it will be light and burnt out or overexposed.
Your optimum performance from a lens is generally somewhere in the middle. You'll get the best performance from your lens. These f-stop numbers will be found on all lenses with slight variations, but they're essentially an international standard. And get to know your f-stops, get to know what a certain f-stop is used in which light conditions so that you can get a feeling for exposures. Setting the exposure on a Handycam is also possible. A professional would always choose a manual exposure. With a Handycam you can use the automatic to tell you what the right exposure is, but if you leave your Handycam on automatic for a shot, every time there's a change in exposure, or someone walks in front of you, or a taxi drives in front of you and changes the exposure values of the shot, your camera will adjust and the lens will pump. It will suddenly adjust and go dark and light. It's called pumping the lens, and this is very unprofessional. A professional always sets the exposure manually. In choosing a proper exposure, try and expose for that which has importance to your scene, and that would allow you to portray the significance of a particular object.
The exposure of a shot should convey the feeling and mood that you want, whilst simultaneously presenting the viewer with a clear picture. As you set your exposure, you must be aware that your depth of field will also be manipulated, because aperture has a direct influence on depth of field. A wide aperture, indicated by a low f-stop number, lets in the most light, but reduces the depth of field. Conversely, a small aperture, indicated by a higher f-stop number, lets little light in, but allows a greater depth of field.
Many people want to know how to get that effect, where the people in foreground of your shot are in focus, or sharp, and the people in the background are out of focus, soft. And that requires you to manipulate your depth of field. In order to get less depth of field, so that only the people in foreground are sharp, you would need to open up your iris. But if you were to open up your iris, you of course would overexpose the shot, unless you decide to do something called sunglasses for your camera, which basically means put an ND filter on your camera. Now ND means neutral density. There is no color to the filter, it's simply dark. It allows your iris to open up and still give you a proper exposure, and it singles out and accentuates the impact of the foreground. Without the ND, there you see that everything is a little sharper, and then with the ND, as it goes in, you suddenly see that things get softer. Now this is because the iris is opening up and the depth of field is getting less. Now, what a shutter is in essence, a shutter is as it sounds. It shuts out light. In other words, use your imagination now. Imagine your eyes are the film, that your eyes are the focal plane, and the light is hitting your eyes and exposing the film. And the shutter is something that opens and closes at a certain speed over time. And that's the important thing with shutter. It's over time. So a slow shutter speed, like this, slowed right down, would allow a lot of time for light to strike the eye, the film in this instance. And when there's a lot of light striking the film, you sometimes need to shut down your iris in order to limit the light. If your shutter was very fast, like this for instance, it doesn't allow much time for the light to hit the film. And in order to get a properly exposed shot, the correlation between your iris would become necessary and your iris would require to open. So the shutter, being fast, lets less light into the lens and you have to open your iris, or if the shutter was very slow, it would let more light into the lens and you'd need to close your iris. Opening and closing the iris affects your depth of field. So there's a correlation between focus, aperture and shutter that is linked completely in all different levels of camera. Okay, we're going to up the shutter speed on the camera, and as the shutter speed goes upwards, it lets in less light, and therefore you can see the aperture is opening. So there's a link between the shutter speed and the aperture. And now what we're going to do is put the exposure on a lock-off manual setting, and we're going to lift the shutter speed piece by piece, and you will see that the shot gets darker because the aperture, due to the fact of being on manual, is unable to compensate. So as I said before, it is possible to use your shutter speed to decrease the amount of light that you have available, forcing you to open your iris to get a properly exposed shot, and therefore decreasing your depth of field, giving you that lovely differentiated look between foreground and background. One of the reasons why we use shutter in a professional shot is in order to see a moving object clearly. Alright, what we're doing now is we're shooting the full mechanism rotating in order to give you an example of a moving object. And what often happens with fast moving objects is that things become a blur. Now the way to avoid the blur is to allow less time for the shutter to be open, therefore allowing less time for each individual frame to be blurred. The reason why you're seeing a blur, especially on low shutter speeds, is the fact that the shutter's open for so long that when it takes each individual frame, the object has moved from the time the shutter opens to the time that the shutter closes. So that means that you're recording the movement per individual frame. But if you were to up the shutter speed, and therefore you allow less time for the object to move while you're taking that individual frame, you can actually get a proper representation of what's happening. The reason why that works is that with a higher shutter speed, the object does not have time to move while you're shooting each individual frame. It's as simple as that. Of course it affects your aperture, and of course that would affect your depth of field. So once again, focus, aperture and shutter are completely interlinked in all ways. And now the mystical procedure of taking a white balance. The reason why you take a white balance is to tell your camera what white is in the scene that is before the camera. Because the camera might be able to guess quite well on automatic, but it doesn't always know, and your shots can look quite sickly if you don't get your white balance right. You've all seen people who look ultra blue, and you've all seen people who look ultra orange. And unless you mean it for the mood and feeling of your scene, it can look like an amateur mistake. White balance is all about color temperature. Daylight is at 5,600 Kelvin, and tungsten light is at 3,200 Kelvin. In order to take a white balance, what you do is you fill the field of view of the camera with a white piece of paper, with the light of the scene that you are shooting falling onto the paper. You expose properly for the white, and then you take the reading by pressing the button. And when you come back to your scene, everything looks normal. If you have mixed illumination, blue from a window and orange from a light, you would need to take a white balance, allowing the blue and the orange light to fall onto your white, so that when you take the white balance, you're telling the camera, this is white. Right, now we're doing a brief recap on everything we've learned about focus, aperture, shutter and color temperature. The director has asked us to compose and expose and focus on a scene, and to get a professional shot out of what you can see now is hardly correct. The director has asked us to keep the foreground in focus with the background completely soft, or as soft as we can get it, and also to minimize the blur of the fan that we have placed in shot. This is our brief. We'll see how quickly we can do it to get a professional shot. Okay, so here we go. We're going to try for this. And we're starting off, of course, with a bit of focusing. You zoom in to get your focus. And of course, you keep the aperture wide open so that you can have the minimal depth of field, allowing you to set that focus critically. And when you zoom out, you can see things suddenly getting sharper. The wider you are, the sharper they will get. Okay, that's focus. Now, as you can see, there's something wrong with the color, and we take a white balance to fix that. Put the white in, fill the frame with white, click the white balance button, telling the camera what white is under those conditions. Remember to take the white balance in the conditions that you are shooting under, and then suddenly things look much better. Let's adjust the depth of field. Minimize the depth of field so that the background can go even softer. Now take a look at those sunglasses and see how sharp they are. Well, they're somewhat out of focus, but it will get more out of focus the moment we add sunglasses to the camera, or ND filters. Here comes the ND filter, causing us to open the iris to expose the shot properly. Remember, we're exposing on the foreground figure, and look how much softer the background is. And our final task is to minimize the blur of the fan in the background. This requires us to up the shutter speed.